our next session this morning, was really inspired by the fact that, well, in 1 year, we can have extreme drought, and the next year, we can have more water than we know what to do with. And sometimes that can be a week apart, or a month apart, or just one hill versus another hill. We have these little microclimates. So how do we manage pastures in these extremes, which have been on the trend recently? So we have two folks presenting today, and we're going to start with Dr. Ed Rayburn, hired from West Virginia University, to talk about full season species. And then we'll have Dr. Pat Keyser joining us.
Thank you. Before I get into my talk, I want to give a big thank you to the folks in Maryland. Over the years, I've had the privilege of working with them. And let me, my postdocs have where we worked on the fatty acid profile and some of those perennials. So I'm just grateful for the working relationships that we've had across state lines here. Actually, my farm is closer to Maryland than it is to Morgantown, where the university is. I'm right next door to Garrett County, Maryland. So anyway, thank you folks from Maryland for the work we've been able to do together. Okay, we're going to talk about pasture management at the extremes. I'm going to limit my talk to food season species, and the majority of the work that I've done has been with on-farm pastures. I have had very little opportunity to work on experimentation pastures, but a lot of opportunity to work out on farmer fields, and I'm grateful for that. Okay, I like photos of plants, animals, and people. I love response curves, and I love economic budgets. Not going to do it. We're going to talk about the to-do lists. Now, for those of you that are farmers, you are farm managers, and you should have to-do lists. You know, what are you supposed to be doing today, right? Isn't that what managers do? At least I think that's what managers should do. I try to do it. What am I supposed to do today versus what maybe I'd like to do today? So our to-do list is we need to develop good soil, sward, and livestock management. I call those the 3 S's. But we need to develop management during normal weather, so that we have good, healthy soils, swards, and stock. And then we know how to, okay, we want to develop a good soils, swards, and stock during normal weather, so that we know how to deal with things when we have bad weather.
You need me to advance it for you?
Well, and I think I can do it, but thank you. Okay.
Give me the high sign. Which one?
Got a good assistant here.
Which button is it, right?
Okay, I've got it where I want right now, but that button right here.
You just tell me.
This is why I like working with farmers, okay? So, now, what's normal? There's some historic average. And if you've been working on a farm for a few years, you know what is kind of average, all right? Now, average, for full season forages, and this is statistically valid for this region, average plus 25%. 25% is what we call a standard deviation, and deviation is movement from average, and we're just calling this standard. We're not going to teach you the math, but between the historic average and plus 1 standard deviation, that happens 2 years out of 6. That's the way to remember. 2 years out of 6, it's going to be between average and 25% more than average. 2 years out of 6, it's going to be average and 25% less than average. Now, 1 year out of 6, it's gonna be less than 25% less than average. And 1 year out of 6, you can expect it to be greater than 25% above average. So that's the simple way to think about what is a standard deviation. But the other way to look at it, if you're trying to calculate an average for nutrient management purposes, if you keep 6 years of record, throw out the highest year and throw out the lowest year, and then average those 4 years in the middle, that gives you a real good estimate of what is the long-term average. Now, that's assuming that climate change doesn't change things. There are I'm not going to get into the politics of climate change right this minute. I hope to say a few words later. But we do know that glaciers are melting. So for whatever reason, it isn't getting warmer. And I also know from personal experience that our weather patterns in West Virginia are changing. So we do have a lot of times we look at 30-year weather data as trends, but I'm not sure they're going to be very predictive with what happens in the next 30 years. Okay, next slide, please. I find drought easier to define and manage than excess water. The 25% loss in pasture forage reduction means I'm going to have sale weight less reduced by about 6%. And I have hard data. So in these bad years, that 25% loss in forage, I only lose 6% of my sale weight. Wet, cloudy weather can reduce sale weight by 10%. So across all farms in a region. And I first saw this in Western New York. We had a real cloudy, wet year, 50 pounds, 50, 60 pounds off the weights of all the cattle coming in through the sale barn. I was treasurer for the feeder sale co-op and writing all the checks. So I got to see it happen on every farm that I wrote checks for. Then I saw it again down here in West Virginia. This was just 2 or 3 years ago. Again, we had a cloudy, wet year, and we were losing across all of our feeder cattle around 50-pound weaning weights. And so I'm saying I've observed that once every 20 years, because I've been doing this for 40 years now. So whatever that statistics, to me, it's a harder thing to deal with. I don't know the exact answer why. Next. So let's talk about soil fertility. Going back to our to-do list, I'd like to have my soil fertility between a pH of 6 and 7. If I'm below 6, we run into issues, and if you're above 7, you're going to start running into issues. So manage at the least expensive level for your current soil situation. And how can I measure that? Soil test, right? Simple, easy. Soil fertility, P and K, I'd like that to be in the optimum range. For the most part within our region, and there are exceptions for this. Most of us are using what's called malic-free soil test. And so for phosphorus, I need different labs are going to report it different ways. We report it in terms of parts per million. And a number of the other labs in the region do also. So phosphorus, I need 30 parts per million. Probably get away with 25. Potassium, it's 90 parts per million. And so if you're less than those levels, forages are a little short. You don't want to pay for getting it higher than that level because you won't get any response. So that's why that those numbers, 30 parts per million for phosphorus, 90 parts per million for potassium, is considered the low end of the optimum range. Now, I say considered. That's considered by the plants because we have yield data that supports those numbers. We'd like 25 to 30% legume. A lot of people are buying nitrogen, but in these mixed grass clover pastures on good healthy soils, 25 to 30% legume is going to be giving you yield equivalent of around 150 pounds of nitrogen. And so you don't need the nitrogen. And I'll give you an example of a good study just using white clover. White clover consistently gave yields equivalent to 125 pounds of nitrogen. That was Ladina clover with fescue. So I would encourage you to strongly look at using legumes as your nitrogen source instead of buying nitrogen. Biologically healthy soils. To me, the number one factor is earthworms, night crawlers. If I see a lot of good night crawlers there, that's an indication I do have a good healthy soil and I do have that organic matter. Now, how many night crawlers do I need? On my farm, I'll usually find night crawler burrows about 8 to 9 inches apart. Okay, and that run, you can do the math. It's several hundred, many thousands of night crawlers per acre. But each one of those burrows, the reason I like to look at the night crawler burrows is one is I can see them without digging up the soil. But those are burrows that go down deep for water to infiltrate and also oxygen to come in and out of the soil. And so to me, the night crawlers are the key species that I look at.
I have a question. So the question is for your soil fertility, your P and K, trying to get it to that lower optimum range there. How do you spread out your application? So like in the case of, I'll get soil tested, it'll say, put out a ton of lime. Well, because I'm in a pasture and I'm not tilling, mixing anything up, I don't want to blast my soil, that top layer with that. So I try to break it up over the year and put out a ton, but not put it out all at the same time. So how are you doing that with the P and K? So you don't overwhelm it.
Good question. I think people heard that. How do I manage pH and P and K? My recommendation and the recommendation that our computer gives out is if the pH drops below 6, apply 2 tons of lime. And the reason for 2 tons of lime is most lime spreaders of bulk lime really can't do less than 2 tons. Now, there is a place for research, I think. If we're just a little bit below 6, should I be looking at low rates of pelleted lime? We just haven't done the research there. Now, on the P and the K, I recommend recycling hay. No, bale grazing. No, on our hayfield. On the pasture, if I have a pasture that's low in K, and I have one, what I want to do is just bulk apply 200 pounds of K2O on there. And the same with phosphorus. I would, how low is it and what is the recommendation for bringing that phosphorus up to the optimum level? Depending on the lab you use, if you were using our lab, we would have you build that up over 2 or 3 applications, not all of it at one time. Again, that comes back to the philosophy in the lab recommendations. If you want to see our recommendations, drop me an email and I can send you the link for the manual that we put together that tells all the why and wherefore. Yes,
And we measure organic matter, and if so, we have a level to give us optimal.
we do, okay, our standard forage soil test does not do organic matter. And I don't push testing organic matter a lot. In the work that we've done on the farmer pastures, in the top 2 inches, we'll have 8 to 10% organic matter. And then of course it drops as you go further into the soil. So in the top 4 inches, we're 8 to 10 here. We're probably doing 6% organic matter altogether. But on the other hand, I've worked with, my daughter's a county agent in North Carolina. Down there, they're lucky to get 1 to 3% organic matter in their soils. So organic matter is very important, but it's going to also differ a whole lot depending on where you are. And I'd say just from my farm in West Virginia, just the other side of Garrett County, to down here, especially when you get on a sandy soil. But organic matter is important, and that's why, for me, looking at the earthworms, I feel is okay. I'm comfortable with using them as my measures of the healthy soil. But you're making a good point. Organic matter is important. Next slide, please. Okay, know the characteristics of the soil within each field or patch. We've already talked about pH and fertility. Question is, could this part of the farm use extra fertility from feeding and the manure from the feeding? Drainage, you can learn that by experience. Your conservation plan, looking at the soil types in that field. The soil web, if you're not familiar with that, you can go to okay, there's the soil web of the University of California, Davis, and then the web soil survey, which is the NRCS website. Soil, they all use the same underlying NRCS database, okay? The soil web is just a little bit easier. You can get an app on your phone, walk out in the field. It'll tell you what is the soil type that you're standing on top of. Okay, and then it will also give you some information about texture, water holding capacity, things like that. I have worked with the NRCS soil surveys all of my life. And they're 95% accurate, I would say. Every once in a while, you will find that they're not. And I just ran into that on a field in North Carolina where this is one time out of 40 years I found an error in the survey. Okay. So in that respect, it's just showing how good the surveys are. I'm not picking on them for having made a mistake. Pointing out that listen to what they say. They put a lot of time and effort. We paid for it. It's good information. So the things that you want to address is, do you have a section that's excessively drained? Is it well drained? Is it poorly drained, or is it flood prone? Flood prone. Like I say, you can figure that out just from experience. Rockiness. Jeff mentioned this. You can get this from experience or a conservation plan. But rockiness is not always bad. Okay. Actually, I want some rockiness on part of my farm. because that prevents punching in wet weather. And we have, good data, from our soil physicists at, Virginia Tech, WVU, not Virginia Tech. We had a very good soil physicist at Virginia Tech too. He was my distant cousin, but Eugenia at WVU did some work out on pastures at our experiment station, showing the benefit of rocks in pasture, during winter feeding on soils. They're beneficial. Next slide, please. Sword diversity and health. I want healthy, deep-rooted plants. Rest interval is a big factor that to give us that deep-rooted plant. I want a healthy, thick sod. Time and intensity of grazing is what I use to develop that thick sod, along with diversity. The species diversity, it's going to be based on soil fertility and sod management. I need sod forming species such as tall fescue. I should have maybe not called it Kentucky 31, but a lot of us already have Kentucky 31. But if you're, we have a lot of new improved tall fescues, okay? And if you have 31, learn to live with it. Most of the farmers in West Virginia, we did a survey, and there was very little I got almost no feedback from farmers showing any interest in getting away from Kentucky 31. They felt they knew how to manage it. They were getting adequate yields, conception, and these were beef producers, okay, not dairy farmers. Now they have also stratified themselves in the fact that the ones that raise stocker cattle are not at low elevation. All of our folks that buy stocker cattle and run them are at high elevation where they don't have the heat stress or as much Kentucky 31 as the folks down around 1,000 feet or below elevation. There you just have cow-calf herds that are calving in January and February. And so they're getting away from this heat stress issue with Kentucky 31 through management. But down here at low elevation, I still would like fescue, but I would go with a fescue that has one of the friendly endophytes versus the Kentucky 31 endophyte. And I'll leave that up to the good seed dealers that can tell you what products they have that meet that criteria. But I know we have a bunch of them. And even for dairy cattle, I visited with a dairy producer out in Missouri, and he was working with New Zealanders that were trying to get the big confinement herds there. And they were using ryegrass under irrigation. But this dairyman said, if you want production per acre, you go with fescue. If you want production per cow, you go with ryegrass. And so that's the point that the fescue, even with the dairy cow, now these are the improved fescues, not Kentucky 31. You can get good milk production off of it and good milk production per acre. Okay, mixed grasses, clovers, and forbs, or are you using clear seeded alfalfa? The reason I bring that in there, you've got to manage that different than if I have a good thick fescue stand. I can do a lot on a fescue stand that I'm not going to do on a clear seeded alfalfa. First of all, I've never had a clear seeded alfalfa on my farm, but that's a different story. Some producers out there do have clear seeded alfalfa. Next slide. So sod forming species, tall fescue, bluegrass, bent grass. I don't know if you've heard of that other than golf courses, but we go out on the pasture and look at these short growing grasses and just call them bluegrass. We might even call them Kentucky bluegrass. There are several species of bluegrass, but we found around Morgantown that half of the so-called bluegrass in our bluegrass pasture was red top bentgrass. So, and I've seen this in New York, go out in the field and not only have red top bentgrass, have colonial bentgrass, which we think of in a golf course, and other bentgrasses. So we have a lot of different bentgrasses, but we usually just call them bluegrass. Reed canary grass, of course, which tolerates really wet soils. Smooth drone grass, amazingly it tolerates wet soils, and both of these do well in both wet and dry sites. Excellent. Okay, stock. Now, what is the adaptation and health of your livestock? What are, looking across your herd at individuals, what are their age? What are their disposition? How productive are they? What is your stocking rate? There's an old Texas proverb, and I don't know how old this was. Probably over 100 years old. But if you stock your farm at 85% of the economic optimum, it's going to cost you about 3% of your net income. So there is a cost, but it takes care of your operation 85% in terms of drought management. So think of it as an insurance premium. I'm cutting my stocking rate a little bit. My insurance premium is 3%, but it's going to take care of drought 85% of the time. Body condition. I want a body condition score of 6 at calving. A lot of folks will say 5. If you look at the data, satisfying with 5 is saying I'm willing to lose 10% of my calf crop. So I'm going to stick with 6 because that's 10%, losing 10% on average is too low. Okay. So, and it's not that hard to wean the calf off the cow, especially if you're weaning that calf in September, even October. But if I have enough good fall forage, that cow is going to come back a good cow. Will come back to body condition score 6 before you have to get into winter feeding. So that's my goal, is to have, I'd like to not feed hay until Christmas time. And I want my cow to be a body condition score 6 or better by Christmas time. And another old saying, I like old sayings, especially if they're true. Okay, a fat cow is half winter. If you think about it, if you're wintering your cattle out, having that body condition score 6, that layer of fat on the back, makes it a lot easier for her to go through a cold spell. And also, when you go back and look at the effective body condition score on feed intake, body condition score 6 versus low end of 5, that's almost 10% difference in feed intake. The fat cow's just going to eat less feed than that skinny cow because she's not stressed. Okay. And you may have seen this in your own herds. You're feeding hay on warm days, they eat so much, but on a cold day, they're going to eat more, right? And so that's what body condition score does to a cow. Okay. In my old age, I'm getting a little bit better body condition score. When I was a little kid, I had a very high body condition score. And we'd go swimming in this cold creek. This is Western New York, almost 2,000 feet elevation. I could swim in that cold creek all day long. My skinny friends would turn blue, and I mean it. They would turn blue and get out, but I could stay there. So that's how I can relate to the body conditions score 6 on the beef cow out in the cold weather. So next slide, please. Okay. Good management for full season grass and legume pastures. This would be, orchard grass, bluegrass clover, or tall fescue clover. And I know I'm gonna get some, eyebrows raised here, but initial forage height. At the start of grazing, I wanted 8 to 12 inches tall. Now, a little bit shorter pre-grazing height, that's gonna give you a little bit younger, higher quality forage. But it also benefits the stand in terms of, good tiller density within the stand. The taller height, pre-grazing height, was gonna give me a little bit older, a little bit lower quality forage, greater forage mass. It's gonna be very good for that stand in hot, dry weather. Okay. Residual forage height at the end of grazing, 2 to 4 inches. I can hear it already, 2 inches. I'm gonna stick with that, and I'll tell you why. Short grazing height is in cool, moist weather. I'm not saying in the heat of the summer or in dry weather. That's in cool, moist weather. It stimulates grass tillers and legumes to thicken the sod. And there's a lot of good data to support that. But we want to limit that management into cool weather and moist weather. The tall height, tall post grazing height is for hot, dry weather to shade the soil and to keep it cool. Now there is, I'm not showing response curve, but I have to go back to a response curve, sorry. We have good data from pastures in West Virginia and New York. I came to West Virginia from upstate New York. I worked with the Soil Conservation Service in the Seneca Trail RC&D program. And so a lot of my data came from there. Okay. But across this whole Allegheny Plateau region, cattle doesn't really, in these cool season pastures, it really doesn't matter how much you have there. On average, they eat 56% of the grass that's there and don't eat the rest. Okay, so we use the old saying, eat half, leave half. The average over about 100 pastures was 56%. That's close enough to eat half, leave half. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just curious, I think. When I see short height and cool moist weather, and we have farm, that needs to be.
No. This is dairy cow and beef cow. You are correct. These are not goats. It would probably, the grass is going to respond. But your goat is what we don't want to do that way. We could probably get away with it with sheep. Well, I know we could get away with it with sheep, but then, yeah, we still have the parasite issue with sheep. But just so you know where I'm coming from, I actually started my life with goats. Okay, and then I progressed to sheep and cattle. So yeah, we're talking the bigger ones here. So there is a place for 2-inch grazing at times, but not all the time. Now, for a typical pasture, the 4-inch height is important because if we drop below a 4-inch height, now we have major impact on forage availability affecting cow feed intake. If it's taller, if the residual forage height is greater than 4 inches, it's the NDF in the forage that is the primary limiter of feed intake. This 4-inch height is 1,200 pounds of dry matter per acre. If I drop below that, now I just don't have enough feed for the cow. So fill its room. on a daily basis. Okay, the clicker works.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you can do it either way, I'm fine.
Okay, rest interval. This is very important, okay? Grazing heights are important, but rest interval is just as important, if not more. Allow pastures to regrow for 21 to 42 days between grazing events. 21 days, this is about what it takes to go from this 2 to 4 to 8 to 12, okay? In the spring, when I've got cool weather, plenty of moisture, you're gonna do that roughly 21 days. Might be a little less, might be a little bit more, depending on how cool it is. In the summer, 42 days is a good ballpark number that we're working with. And again, I'm talking the normal summer, not the drought summer or the excessively wet summer. Grazing stay. Require the livestock to graze a pasture to the residual forage height in 7 days or less. 3 days is better than 7. 1 day is better than 3. Why do I say 7? Any of you have a farm but have a job off the farm? Raise your hand if you do. Okay. The 7 days is for the human. Okay. That's our work schedule. It just so happens that it also works pretty darn well for the grass and the clover. Okay. If you can get to the 7 day stay or less, you're basically 90% where you want to be. But it works in with your work schedule of working off the farm. So that's why I stick with the 7 days. When I was working with SCS, they always said 6 days or less. Anyway, but I will admit, I think you can see a visual difference, between 3 days and 7 days, if you have the time and effort to do a more intense rotation. With dairy cows, we would do a 1 day stay, and even a 12-hour stay with dairy cows, because you could be there pretty easily twice a day. Now you're going to hear some people say, well, I move the cows, every 15 minutes or every hour. Now there's one value in that. It's called bragging rights. Okay. If you get down to the biology and behavior of the cow, I could see a person justifying 3 times a day, because a cow, a naturally grazing cow will tend to have up to 3 bouts of grazing a day. But again, I'm not looking for bragging rights. I just want good, healthy cattle, good, healthy sod, and good, healthy soil. And most of my pastures are somewhere between 3 and 7 days stay. And that's where I'm getting those night crawlers every 8 to 9 inches apart. So I'm happy. Next slide, please. Okay, plan ahead for droughts and wet weather. They are going to happen. So, managing for drought. Stock the farm at 85% of the optimum. To manage for drought 85% of the time. Yes, there's going to be a 3% cost. And that 3% cost is actually from a non-farm study. Okay. To be totally clear, it was my farm. Okay. But I had validation from a large farm in Virginia. I only run my 85% on my farm is 30 head of cattle on 90 acres. But working with a fellow in Virginia where they run 800 head of cattle on several thousand acres, they're basically getting the same number. And the bottom line is, all we're doing is on that 85%, is we're validating what they've told us from Texas for decades. So to me, that's to me, that's the big thing. I like it when I can validate what the farmers say. Okay, the little thing was that 3% cost that I documented on my phone. Yes, sir.
What do you call the stocking rate?
What is optimal stocking rate? That's a very good question. Okay, let's go back to this case study. I was running 40 head of cattle on 90 acres plus some rented hay ground. We got a big drought. This was a 1 in 100-year drought based on probability. This was back in the 90s. So I sold half the herd because I didn't have feed for them. Now, it's not bad to sell half the herd. I've done this twice in my life. You sell the bottom end of the herd. So I have a better herd to start. At this point in time, I have a better herd because I got rid of all of the cows that I thought were problem cows that year. Okay. So I dropped down to 20 head, and then over time, I built back the herd. And then this was not an experiment. This is just what I did. Then a few years after I had done that, I said to myself, duh, I've got data there. Let's go back and look at it. And now I had used similar bulls through the years that I rebuilt the herd. And so I looked at my stocking rate and my sale weight on calves. And my management was basically the same for the calves post-weaning. And so I could just draw the line. As I increase stocking rate, you can see the effect on sale weight of calves. Now you're making me deal response group here. And I said, oh, I'm going to do this. Okay. So I could see that response in sale weight, and it's just pretty much a straight line. And then you can just do the economics, what is the value of these calves at these different sale weights? What is the cost for me running a cow in terms of health management, hay, things like that. And then you just can calculate the optimum. Now, here's the way I interpret it for the farmer that doesn't want to run the experiment. Okay. For a beef cow, a cow-calf herd, I want to be able to graze in West Virginia to ideally the 1st of January. Not later than that, historically, because I could get hit with too much snow and ice. That I don't want to, I'm still saying that I don't mind grazing off all of my stockpile fescue by the 1st of January. But I want my cow to be in a body condition score 6 or better, also by the 1st of January or Christmas, whichever date you want to pull. If I'm doing that, I feel I'm probably near that optimum because I've used up my pasture in this situation. Now, yes, I'm going to be feeding hay in January, February, March, and April. But again, using historical weather events up there, no, that's what works because of snow. We can get too much snow. Jeff, are you still here? What do you think would be a good, okay, in terms of body condition score of the cow and how far I could graze my fescue, what would you use at this elevation? And Jeff, that's what I would have said, so thank you. Because once we come down to this elevation, I would have said about a month different. Because you're going to also start grazing in the 1st of April, right? And I can't start grazing until the 1st of May. Because I'm at, what's your elevation? And so I'm basically 1,500 feet higher. than he is. And elevation reigns. Once you're on the same latitude, elevation tells you what's gonna happen. So thank you. You're saying you ought to be able to graze until the 1st of February. But you'd still like your cow in that body condition score 5, preferably 6, maybe. Okay, we're close enough. Thank you. Does that help? Somewhat. Okay. You need to have adequate water distribution and volume. You need to know what fields are going to benefit from grazing. And that's why, if you know that, sometimes it's better to buy hay than to buy fertilizer. I bought hay from a neighbor. The best situation, I bought hay from a neighbor and he stored it in his barn and I could take it out when I wanted it. I paid $110 a ton for that hay. But once I adjusted for the fertilizer I was bringing home, I was only paying $60 a ton for feed. Because there was $50 worth of fertilizer in that hay. That year. So think of that. Think of forage testing, because that tells you the fertilizer value in the hay. And think of buying hay instead of fertilizing. So soil test. Soil test, not just to tell you to go out and buy fertilizer, but to tell you where to feed hay. Okay. Okay, when the grass stops growing, confine the livestock to that feeding area that you've identified. There's a lot of temptation to let the cattle just go to the whole area, the whole farm. I know that temptation. I've felt it. Even when I knew I shouldn't do it, I felt the temptation. Okay. But what happens if I have 4 inches of, this is a hot, dry drought, and I left 4 inches. So I've got some green leaf area there. The temptation is to let the cow graze that green leaf area, but you don't want to. That green leaf, even though it's not growing, is fixing sugar. There are 2 growth stages. Okay, 2 things that green leaf is showing that plant's doing. It's fixing some sugar because you have photosynthesis, even though it's not growing. The other thing is that plant will be doing some cell division. That's the first stage of growth, is cell division. But those cells can't grow because they don't have water. Okay. But if I have sugar and if I have cell division underneath that green leaf, plus I have cooler temperatures underneath that green leaf, then when I do get rain, you're going to get compensatory growth out of that pasture. And it will be quick. Now, how quick? I don't have research data on this. I just have experience. We're talking a matter of weeks. Okay. And I mean short weeks. I'm not talking 6 or 10 weeks. I'm talking 2 to 3 weeks. Growth there. Growth rate. So you want to confine the cattle to a small part of the farm. Hopefully have much of the farm short but green. And then when you get the growth back, the rain back, then when the tall grasses are back to 8 inches, now I can get into rotating the cattle through the farm again. And do take a look. If you have mixed stands of, say, orchard grass and bluegrass, the thing I've found with feeding, even on the abuse area, if the cattle are getting the feed they need, the cattle aren't going to graze the orchard grass below 2 inches in that hot weather. The bluegrass may disappear because bluegrass has, rhizomes in the soil. And so you may lose all your bluegrass, visually. But I'll still have orchard grass there as long as I'm feeding the cattle adequately, around 2 inches. And that's where the bulk of the growth material is in orchard grass. And then when I get the rain back, that's when the bluegrass is gonna come back above the soil surface, or the red top. Red top's just like bluegrass, it has a rhizome under the soil. But just something that you'll see. Okay,
Make sure that we have plenty of time.
yes, you are correct. Move feeders to spread manure over the area. Next. Okay, know your livestock age, temperament, productivity, health. Sell the low end of the herd if and when needed. Wean young stock and feed supplements. That allows the cow not to need as much feed, and she'll put on, she'll get her body condition score back. Inventory your pasture and hay to know what is your feed supply. It's easy to inventory hay. You should have experience with how much a bale will feed, and you can always count the bales, okay? Inventory your pasture. There are different ways of doing that. But inventory the animals so you know their feed demand. Price hay and livestock. Because the question you need to ask, is it better to buy hay or to sell livestock? There are always cows in your herd that you should get rid of. No, you're the one that has to make that determination. As I've said, twice I've cut my herd in half and ended up with a better herd each time. And but that you know that by knowing your livestock up front, cow by cow. They have a number or a name, okay? Now monitor conditions, plan and implement the plan ahead of the market. Now you say, how can I do that? By doing all the things above that, okay? And paying attention to what's going on. Because there are people out there that are going to be doing this before the market. No, your better managers already do this. This is not new information. I know of a producer out in, I think it's Nebraska or Wyoming, and then one in Virginia. They already do all these things, and their purpose in life is to beat the market. Yes, they time the market. They know what's going on. They make a decision. They sell the cows before the market crashes. If they're buying hay, they most of them do it from the livestock side, not buying hay. The one fella does it from selling hay. If he doesn't need the hay, he sells the hay when he can get the most out of the hay. So, next slide. Okay, the healthy soil and good sods recover best in wet weather. We're switching over from dry weather to wet weather. So if I have a healthy sod, that's gonna handle wet weather a lot better than a poor sod, okay? Also these sod forming species like fescue, bluegrass, bentgrass, they self-repair after pugging damage. Non-healthy soils can be invigorated by proper abuse, nutrition, and overseed. So keep that in mind too. But we want to limit hard abuse by rotation. We do need hard stands around waterers in wet weather, gravel, geotextiles under the gravel, or other things. Avoid poorly drained soils when extremely wet. This is where the rocky soils can really come into value. Okay, if you have them on the farm. I had rocky soils on my farm. On the other hand, my brother in North Carolina didn't have a rock on the farm, okay? And so that's where you can see the complete difference. Next slide. Barn feeding if an option. Some folks have barns. If you go back and visit with or listen to farmers in England, a lot of them pull the animals totally off pasture and feed in barns during wet weather. Partly because they're using ryegrass, which is not a good sod forming species. And they're putting the emphasis on protecting their sod. And some of us, some folks in the region do have NRCS barns that do allow them to feed in the barn. Another thing that we've done work on is wood chips, wood chip pads. You can use the small wood chips like you get from Asperon, but if you're actually making a wood chip pad for livestock, it's better to use larger chips. But, move hay out of the flood zone. I've been surprised at how many farmers I've known that knew they made hay in the floodplain. They didn't get the hay out of the floodplain, and then the flood came. Okay, overseed, move livestock out of the floodplain, overseed as needed. Okay, management, trust and help Mother Nature, forbs heal and help heal the soil, train livestock to eat forbs. And we can talk about this later, but the main forbs, plantain, dandelion, dock, common milkweed, and even up to Canada thistle. I've talked too much. Next slide. Fat cows half winter, the eye of the master fattens the cattle, stock at 85%. The footsteps of the farmer, the best fertilizer, begin with the end in mind. And that's all I have.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Ed. We're gonna hold some questions for now, and I'm gonna stop sharing and we're going to pass it over to Pat Keyser to join us.
Well, Jen and company, thank you all for the opportunity to share some of this information with you. Sorry that I couldn't be there in person. I told Jen that man, calamity with my back and made it traveling kind of impractical. So I will try it this way and hope technology does not fail us here. So I'm going to focus on warm season grasses, and of course that was my job, I think. And Ed, thank you for the information on the cool seasons. One of the curves that I assume everybody has seen before, but if not, we'll show it to you again. And Jen, are y'all able to see my cursor?
Yes, we are.
Yes. Okay. Again, this classic curve, we get all this production out of our warm season in the summer, and so that's important. These summer grasses are something that, if we want to get all fancy here, are called C4 grasses. That has to do with their metabolic pathway, 4 carbon molecules instead of 3 like your cool seasons. But the important thing for us with these warm season grasses is that C4 metabolism comes with a kind of a complete package. And that package makes these warm season grasses really very resilient in the face of extremes. And so when we talk about weather extremes, to my way of thinking, we're almost talking about warm season grasses in terms of the things that they can do for us. Now, there's a whole lot of warm season grasses, and I've just put 4 up here and really 5, but there are many warm season grasses out there that we can think of and talk about.
Me to do
What I've tried to do is highlight some basic values of these grasses, and I've painted red font here, some things that I think ought to cause us to slow down a little bit. So, sorghum Sudan, just as an example, we know that it can have toxin issues. That doesn't mean we shouldn't use it. It just means we need to be aware of that. The other thing we need to recognize is that when we start planting these annuals that have to be planted every year, we start getting into some pretty good expense in terms of our operation. One nice thing about crabgrass is that we can plant that once, and if things go well for us, it can do a really good job of reseeding. So crabgrass is a heck of a good date. But when you put all this together, there's a few generalizations we can make about these annuals. One is that they're very flexible. And from a forage quality standpoint, most of the ones we'd go to the trouble to plant really are good quality forages. Some of the volunteers we get out there, foxtail, goosegrass, and there's a number of others I'm sure we could all put our heads together and come up with, broom sedge, nimblewheel. Of course, those aren't annuals, but some of these other species that come into our pastures aren't really good forages. Now they're cheap because they're volunteers, but they're not necessarily good forages and don't necessarily put on a lot of production. So these are things that we need to be aware of as we think about annuals as a forage tool. But we can also think about perennials as a forage tool. And Ed, I'm not sure West Virginia, I'm pretty confident y'all don't grow a lot of Bermuda. I assume that's true in New England, New York State, Pennsylvania. Eastern Virginia, Eastern Maryland, probably Southern New Jersey. I imagine y'all able to grow some Bermuda. Quality there kind of varies. It depends on whether you talk about common Bermuda, whether you talk about some of the hybrids. But again, most of the hybrids do less well further north. Some of the hybrids have some tremendous yields. Even common can have tremendous yields. But here's the trick with Bermuda grass is we've got to have the fertility to make it work if we're going to have high yields. So in a low fertility environment, Bermuda grass is not going to be that productive. We're not going to see these 6 tons of forage per acre, for instance. Johnson grass, tremendous forage, but toxins. And I don't know what all the state laws are up there, but I know for a lot of states, Johnson grass is considered a noxious weed and is banned by noxious weed laws. Of course, the Johnson grass doesn't read those laws, so it keeps growing. But the point is we don't necessarily want to promote it. And it can drive your management on your farm. It's not going to be a passive member of the pasture team. So again, a lot of choices that we have here. Some are limited in terms of winter kill. I've already talked about the limitations of Bermuda grass. And Jen, I don't know. I know that in North Missouri, they don't grow Dallas grass. I'm guessing, and Ed, you may know more about this, but if we get up into Pennsylvania, I assume we start running, and even West Virginia, we probably don't see as much Dallas grass. So I'm not sure if that's kind of limited how far north it goes. I'm going to focus more of my talk today on natives just because that's what I work with for my day job. And natives, like all other grasses, have their weaknesses. It's not so much in forage quality or winter kill. There are varieties of natives, and I'll show you this later on. I can grow well into Canada. No documented toxin issues. There's some with Indian grass, but there's never been a case where we've known of an animal to die from Indian grass. We just know that it has some propensity for nitrates. Cost, once they're growing, moderate to low. Getting them there is more expensive. But the real challenge with natives is putting them on your farm. And they do require more management. So every grass has its weakness. Every grass has its strength. But one point I want to make on this next chart, this is 2 summer forages. The green line is Eastern Gamma grass. The yellow line is the sorghum Sudan hybrid. So in this case, this was over 3 years. So this is data over 3 years. And there's a couple of really important lessons that I want to drive home about the difference between perennials versus annuals. So this perennial, on average, we started grazing, I believe it was May 7th. On average, over the 3 years, we did not start grazing the Sudan grass, sorghum Sudan grass, until June 13th, it occurs to me. In any case, it was a 37-day gap. And so that's problem number 1. Problem number 2 is I'm getting a lot more carrying capacity out of this perennial. And so as a generalization, while there's always a role for annuals. As a generalization, though, if you want to build a system for extremes, I would not build it on annuals. So if you think about when you want to plant, at least at our latitude here in Tennessee, we want to plant this about mid-May. And that's true for all our summer annuals. Well, what if in mid-May it's already started the drought? Well, I'm not going to get much out of my stand. So maybe, and we've had terrible droughts in May. So you're at the mercy of whatever weather conditions there are to get a good stand, and you are spending money. And depending on what annual you're planting, you may run into some toxicity issues. In this particular study, over the 3 years, we accumulated about 200 grazing days per acre off the gamma grass and about 81 grazing days per acre off the Sudan grass. So for all these reasons, it's reliable. I can wake up on May 1st and there's a drought and I don't have to worry about it. I've got a perennial there. Now, this isn't just true about Eastern gamma grass or sorghum Sudan. This is true about any perennial warm season grass and any annual warm season grass. So to me, if you want to be ready for climate extremes over the next decade or two, I think you need to think very seriously about incorporating a warm season perennial grass into your forage program. Now, again, I know this is mid-Atlantic and depending on where you are in the mid-Atlantic up on the Allegheny Plateau in Pennsylvania, probably a lot less imperative to do this than there is in Eastern Virginia or Eastern Maryland or maybe Southeastern Pennsylvania down off the plateau. But the point is, having a perennial, I think, is a really good investment and a really good, especially a warm season perennial, a really good buffer against some climate extremes. So I've mentioned native warm season grasses. There's 5 species that we often talk about. There's actually about 1,200 species of grass native to North America, but our focus really is on these species because they have obvious implications for forage production. And they all grow in the warm season. You saw the growth curve. They're all bunch grasses like you see with this little blue stem plant here. And they're all native. They were here before Columbus, right? So that's what we mean when we talk about a native warm season grass. Now, just like Ed did, I want to kind of walk through a few issues here, and the obvious one is drought. This is a picture from central Kentucky, and I don't know if in the much of the Northeast, far Northeast in the United States, if you run into that kind of extreme drought during summers, but I'll tell you in Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and Ed, I assume a lot of West Virginia, Greenbrier Valley, South Branch Valley, this would not be a rare sight. And so drought is a big problem, but what I think we often overlook with drought is, sure, you've got these problems up here. Yeah, okay, so my pasture productivity is down. I might be facing some toxins. So these short a year of the drought, but maybe what we pay less attention to is the fact that that drought is a gift that keeps on giving. A lot of these things, Ed, you talked about, well, I improved my herd, and that's a good thing. But you also run into problems with degraded pastures that sometimes take 2, 3, 4 years to straighten back out. And so just understand that drought impacts us. And as Ed said, we don't know when the next severe drought's going to be, but we know we're going to get one. And we know that it's going to have a lingering effect. There's going to be a hangover. And so we need to find a solution. Here is a pasture in North Missouri. And again, kind of a familiar sight through a lot of the fescue belt. We're looking at burned up fescue in the summer. That was a D2, D3 drought. I was 5 miles away to a workshop, and that's what the native warm season grasses look like. Very, very drought tolerant. So this is part of why we want to look at these C4 grasses, why we want to look at these species, because they can produce forage in an environment where our cool season grasses have flat out had their hind parts kicked. So just to drive this home, I don't want to beat y'all to death with a lot of data, but I'll throw a few data slides in here. This is a switchgrass study from Western Tennessee. You can see the years there at the bottom when it was conducted, and this is the yield. We had a really good year in 2006, 2007, not so much. But the average across those 4 yields was just shy of 8 tons per acre of dry matter yield. However, in 2007, we were down to 5 tons. Why was that? Well, 2007 was one of the worst drought years we have ever recorded in the state of Tennessee. And yet that switchgrass produced 5 tons of biomass per acre. And if we compare that to what we consider sort of a norm for tall fescue in the fescue belt of about 3 tons per acre, I beat the average of tall fescue in the driest summer, one of the driest summers we've recorded with this warm season grass. And so that's just an anecdote. That study was not set up to study drought. It was set up to study seeding rates and harvest regimes and nitrogen inputs. But by the same token, we got lucky, so to speak, having a bad drought. And by the way, 2008 was a really bad drought as well. And so to be able to produce that kind of forage in the face of drought is an obvious advantage. Well, there's two reasons that both have to do with, well, one of them has to do with C4 metabolism, and that is water use efficiency. So again, kind of going all science nerd on you here, but this is from a study we're just wrapping up. And what you see, in fact, that pasture I just showed you a few minutes that was so green in the summer, the water use efficiency is just a measure of how many pounds of forage are produced for each inch of rain. And so what you see here is the purple bars are big blue stem Indian grass, that pasture you saw in that slide just previously. And the green bars, blue bars are tall fescue. What you can see is for each inch of water throughout the summer, the warm season grass produced more forage. It turned out to be about a 65% advantage, which again, that's pretty helpful in a dry summer or dry period during the summer. We've also just wrapped up, actually this was a couple of years ago, a study where we looked at seedling survival in the greenhouse. And what we did is once the seedlings were established, we just quit watering them. We wanted to see how long they would survive. And one thing I want you to notice here is, and these are seedlings, these are not established plants, but what I want you to see here is that these natives kind of won the derby relative to Bermuda, crabgrass, sorghum Sudan, pearl millet. So again, the perennial has an advantage. The natives are very drought tolerant in and of themselves, as are C4s more generally. So a great tool to have in your toolbox. One other thing I want to mention about this whole C4 thing is another advantage is that this isn't always true, but generally we get some very high yields out of our C4 grasses. And what you see here, this is from a variety trial in Kentucky, the blue bar, that went about 7 years, and we did one modeled on theirs for about 3 years, and we got pretty similar yields, pretty impressive yields. As fate would have it, at the Kentucky location, they were also doing a Kentucky 31 trial, and same farm manager, same kind of management approach, and they got about 3 tons, which kind of reinforces that message I just mentioned about what we think we see with fescue and what we think we see with natives. But there's another detail here that when you dig into a little bit, some of y'all may be old enough to remember Paul Harvey and the rest of the story. But in this case, the rest of the story is that over here, we and Kentucky use 60 units of nitrogen a year and 1 or 2 harvests per year. On the Kentucky 31, they used 180 units of nitrogen and up to 4 harvests per year to achieve this yield. So with only a third of the nitrogen, and I completely agree with what Ed said about, if we can get away from inorganic fertilizer inputs, we're money ahead in every respect. And yet we got 56% more yield with 1/3 the nitrogen. So I'm tempted to say you do the math, partly because I don't want to, but you get the idea. Less inputs, more yield equals more profit or net revenue. One other thing I want to talk about that really has nothing to do with drought, but for folks that are not familiar with native warm season grasses, what I have found is that a lot of folks just assume they're low quality forages. And there's probably some good reasons why they make that assumption. Speaking of which, I've talked about C4 grasses. C4 grasses, as a rule, have higher fiber concentrations than C3. So that's one reason people tend to think they're poor grasses. But a book on forages that was put out by several folks in the forage industry several years back now, Southern Forages, Don Ball was the lead author there from Auburn University. They made the statement in the book, and I completely agree with it. The real test of a forage's quality is not a lab test, it's the animal. And what you see here is the rates of gain on weaned steers. And again, pretty daggone impressive rates of gain. If you look at some of these early season ones, these are crowding silage rates. Now, what you did see is late summer, that rate of gain dropped, and these were, again, continually grazed. And that gives you some idea of what those pastures look like by late summer. Pretty fibrous, pretty beat down, not in great shape. So that doesn't really shock us. But management, and Ed talked about management, and I couldn't agree with them more about how important it is. And I will simplify management of grazing into managing a canopy, respecting the thing called leaf surface area. And so in this particular study, we had a little different management strategy that I won't dive into. But in July and August combined, look at these rates of gain. Again, weaned steers, weaned heifers, very similar. And the difference was what those pastures looked like. They were kept vegetative by our management, and the animals did well on them. I should point out this particular slide here may not look like it, but that's a D2 drought. You'd have to convince those cattle that was the case. But I did want to take that little step aside to emphasize that, okay, so you're getting a lot of yield of drought tolerant from these natives, but it is a good quality, because that's a legitimate question someone may have. There's another reason that natives do well, and perhaps a little better than some of the other warm season perennials, and that is because they have these legendary deep root systems. So they're able to tap into soil moisture that is not generally available to other grasses, particularly short-rooted grasses. This is a little unfair here, whoever drew this picture. I just stole it off the interwebs, but they're showing a turf grass. Okay, so if you're mowing a turf grass, very short roots, there's an important lesson here, though, on management. And, fescue, well-managed fescue, I have a couple of foot of root down there. But the point is that if you defoliate a plant repeatedly short, you're going to weaken the root system. We've known that, Ed, since 1955, and Mr. Kreider's study on root defoliation, or defoliation and root growth. So, yes, they have deep roots, but management matters. So, about drought tolerance. Extreme sites are kind of a surrogate, really, for extreme conditions. And we're not changing your farm to be one that is real extreme conditions, but if the weather and the climate bring us that, then maybe your farm becomes extreme. So this picture is a blue stem pasture on a Kentucky strip bench. And I don't want to go into how we established it. It was a circus, but this is not soil, folks. This is, in fact, Ed mentioned soil surveys. Under soil surveys, this is not listed as a soil. It's listed as unconsolidated material. So it's just turned over, churned, full of rocks, but we've got it. Now, we're not going to see any 4 or 5 ton per acre productivity here. This is probably less than 2 tons per acre, probably a third or a quarter of what some of those numbers I've been showing you, because it's such a poor site. But the point is, it's producing beef, and it's producing high quality forage. Just to drive this point home a little bit further, I live in East Tennessee, and I was up in Smoky Mountain National Park, and this is the hiking trail, and you can see that high quality soil right there, and you can see these rocks, and I couldn't help myself. I had to take this picture. That is a little blue stem plant. So if you want to know if these natives can thrive, or at least grow on extreme sites, there's right. So you're up 3,000 feet growing on a rock, and in the background you can see some Virginia pine, briars, brush. This is not a good place. This is a Southwest aspect, hot, dry, droughty soils. And if you don't believe the smoke, let me take you all the way across the country to a place that, if you love cattle and you love grass, you need to go here, the Nebraska Sandhills. And so you see a picture of it in the summer, and that's kind of what it looks like. Is an area probably 2 times the size of the state of Maryland, that's nothing but rolling sandhills and native prairie, blue stem of several different species. This is a picture of it in the winter, but again, you can kind of see that rolling nature. And this is a close-up from up on this ridge. And what you can see is this place is legitimately called the Sandhills. I mean, that's like beach sand down there. And so with 20 inches of rainfall a year and deep sands, these grasses thrive. So if you want to talk about extreme conditions, I think we can cover you. Let me go to the other end of the spectrum, and let's talk about wet sites. So what you're looking at right there is a pasture that a gentleman has that was full of weeds and rushes. It wasn't producing any forage for him. It was a weedy, rushy mess, and he couldn't get into it until well into the spring. In fact, when you walk through there in even May, you had to kind of pick your path unless you had knee boots on. Otherwise, and even knee boots might not help you in some spots. So what we did is we planted this to a lowland cultivar switchgrass, and you can see these seedlings. It was planted late this spring. And I want to point out, you can see the switchgrass seedlings, but also want you to see this rush. So this is, wet weather plant right here, wet ground plant. And the seedlings are struggling to survive in this environment, right? They're trying to make it. Well, fast forward to the following spring, And what you can see is a very well stocked stand of switchgrass. And this gentleman was able to graze every cow he had for most of the summer on this pasture. So we went from growing weeds and rushes to a really high quality summer pasture. So on the wet end of the spectrum, there are grasses, and that's again an advantage of these natives. If the correct species of native, correct cultivar, it'll grow on anything from that site I just showed you, the little blue stem, to this here. And of course, there's Eastern Gamma grass, which is notoriously good at growing in wet sites. And this is early in the spring, but you get some idea that this particular pasture, I don't know if I caught any of them in that scene right there, but it's full of crawfish chimneys. So that there's a serious gumbo soil, but still growing good forage. One other example of this, going back to switchgrass, this is up in Virginia. But this gentleman had this floodplain that you see in front along Stanton River, and he wasn't getting good forage out of it. It would flood periodically. There was no dam upstream to keep the floods off it. And he just wasn't getting reliable, consistent forage. So he and a buddy of his went out and illegally, I guess, by Virginia law at the time, bought a bunch of Johnson grass seed to sow out there. And I get a kick out of it because couldn't get a Johnson grass stand. And those of y'all that live in Johnson grass country know that you almost can't avoid getting Johnson grass sometimes. But like it or not, they couldn't get a stand. I was down in Alabama a couple years ago, and that they rely on Johnson grass or light Johnson grass for summer forage in this particular area because they can't grow Dallas or Bermuda grass. It's prairie soils. And they had the same problem of not being able to establish Johnson grass. And I love the comment the fellow manages the farm had. He said, yeah, the way you can get Johnson grass to grow in a field is just park a bean planter out by the gate. So I guess that's how you do it. But the point is, in this very wet bottom, he was able to plant that switchgrass and has had tremendous forage production for 21 years. Up to that picture was taken. That picture is several years old. So extreme conditions, flood, drought, if we look for the right tool, we can create a buffer between us and really hard times. Let's talk a little bit about fertility. This is a study that a student of mine is wrapped up recently that was done up in Ohio at the Green Acres Foundation greenhouse study. But one of the things we did is we manipulated, by the way, that's a mixture of, I think it's 2 parts soil, 1 part sand. So it's not potting media. It is soil. Sand's in there to make it easy to separate the roots when the study was over and weigh the roots and measure the roots. But we tried 4 different pH levels in these pots. You can see the different color markers and so forth. So those are the pH rates that we looked at. And he found absolutely no relationship between any measure of seedling germination or growth and pH. These species were impervious to pH, even as low as 4.5. So we did a follow-up study. This is up in New York, in southern part of New York. And I love this slide because it looks real sciencey, right? We got our shade structures here and our rain-out shelters here. But we also looked at pH here. And we got a little aggravated with that 4.5 not showing up in Ohio. So we said, well, let's go to 4.0. And can you imagine? Again, no relationship between pH and seedling germination, survival, and growth. Now, something kind of fun to show you. These little patches that you can make out that are barren, those are pH 4 plots. So these are square meter plots. And pH 4 does a number on the competition, but it did not change the number of seedlings germinating or the rate of growth of those seedlings. And while this seems almost shocking, it is something that's been documented elsewhere. We're not the first people to do this, but it seems apparent that in terms of pH, native grasses really aren't that concerned about it. Many years ago, Ed, I don't know if you knew him, Jerry Young did work up in Pennsylvania coal fields and reported some similar things. He wasn't looking at establishment, but growth. So again, pH is not a big boogeyman for our native grasses. We've also done some research working on getting the publication out on this, looking at phosphorus, and there's 2 species here, big blue stem and switchgrass. And in terms of yield, there was no relationship between yield for either species and phosphorus, which kind of surprised us, but anyway, that's what we found. And on potassium, same thing. No relationship between yield and potassium levels. And we had a fairly wide range of potassium levels in the soil in both cases, but no relationship to yield. And what all this is telling us is that these grasses are adapted to grow on extreme sites. And so if we're thinking about extreme weather or extreme conditions, why not use a grass that can work with extreme conditions? Now, one place where this story changes is when it comes to nitrogen. So very clearly what we saw, and this was a companion study to the P and K I just showed you, it's very clear that all three of these forages respond positively to inputs of nitrogen. And what you can see is that in the case of switchgrass, statistically speaking, we didn't see any improvement over about 60 units. And for the other two, it was up to about 120 before we saw a lack of response, statistical response. We haven't done the economics on this, so my guess is, depending on what you assume about price of nitrogen, these may slide up or down just a little bit, probably down. Well, at a second site, also over 7 years, we did the same thing, and we saw very little response. And this was kind of a damp-natured, poorly drained site. And so one of the cautions here is, and Alan Franzlubers and Matt Poor at North Carolina State have been doing some work on this with tall fescue and stockpiling, but not in every case, just throwing nitrogen at it, create the response we want. Where we've got drought, where we've got poor internal drainage, we don't see the responses. And another interesting thing, where we have high biological activity, we don't necessarily see the response because we've already got a lot of nitrogen being cycled in that soil and available to the plants. So in any case, unlike P and K and pH, nitrogen can be our friend in managing these grasses, but it doesn't necessarily have to be at a high rate. And again, the caution of, if you're in a drought year or a damp site or some other conditions, you may want to be watching fairly closely what's going on with your investment in nitrogen. You may not be getting what you hope you're getting. So taking this to the take home, the bottom line, yields, good animal performance, and low inputs in terms of pH, no lime, no P, no K. This is in a grazing environment. Again, we saw some pretty good performance in terms of net returns out of the natives. One comment about crabgrass. I mentioned earlier, crabgrass can be reseeded naturally very well. In this particular study, what we chose to do is plant it every year just to be sure that we had it. So our ag economist who did this analysis here went back and reanalyzed crabgrass and took out the second and third year reseeding. So over a 3-year horizon, what we found is that crabgrass's profitability was up here comparable to Bermuda grass. But again, for a summer grazing season on wean steers, we did pretty well. This is a slide I put together with some of our studies and a publication from Don Ball there, Auburn, a few years ago. But if we're trying to manage for extremes, it seems to me that input costs are really, really important. So if our revenue is going down in a bad summer because of climate situations, whether it's drought or flood, less money that we have out of our pocket, the better off we are. And so these are cost per pound of gain. So we can talk about different forages and say, wow, this one produces so many pounds of gain, average daily gain. This one produces that much. This commodity feed produces so much. But what we got to look at is, what is the cost of that forage? And by the way, I mentioned commodity feeds. Commodity feeds would fill in the bottom line here and be closer to $3 a pound rather than what you're seeing here. But there's a couple important lessons here. One of them is that we're seeing good performance from these natives. A second important lesson is when you give forage, and let's see, Bermuda grass. So I'm using a legume with Bermuda grass, and here I'm using inorganic nitrogen. So I'm looking at 195 versus 69. That is a big difference, and that gets back to these inputs. Another thing I mentioned earlier about these annuals. So again, Where I've got annuals, they cost me. And unlike crabgrass, sorghum Sudan is going to need to be replanted every year. So perennial warm season grasses are our friend, and natives show up particularly well in that scenario. Was there a comment? No.
Nope, I don't think so.
Okay. So this is out of that same study I just showed you, the economic study, a couple of slides ago. And again, this kind of gets back to this whole idea about risk. So this is what they call a stoplight graph. And what this means, and this basically takes into account the production of the pasture, the cost of the pasture, the cost of the steers, and the market value over the steers over a long period. And what it shows you is that, well, let me pick on switchgrass. Based on long-term market history of steer values and what these pastures did, very rarely would you expect to have a negative return on switchgrass. You would often expect to have a positive one. The other one I want to pick on is crabgrass. Again, it's an annual, so a lot of variation in the quality of the stand you get, a lot of expense in it. And so these perennials, the Eastern Gamma grass is more expensive to establish, but the Bermuda grass, the switch grass, the big blue stem, a lot less risk of a bad year than there is with an annual. And so keep that in mind. You know, even though you think of crabgrass or summer annuals being easy to establish, that they can fail as well, and I've seen it plenty of times, or at least get a poor stand. So there is risk avoidance in a perennial. So let's talk about cold. We've talked about drought, flood, we've talked about fertility. Let's talk about cold. This is a map that was put together by some scientists that showed where the historic warm season grass prairies used to extend to. And what you can see is up into southern Minnesota, certainly Nebraska, eastern South Dakota. So in other words, a very, very cold climate, C4 grasses were able to remain competitive. Another look at that, and this is a map that was put together to reflect projected switchgrass yields based on a lot of different trials. And what I wanted you to see here is even way up in the Hudson Valley, all the way up to Lake Champlain. I think that's the Mohawk Valley of New York. I'm not sure what that is, but the point is, even up here on the Allegheny Plateau, we're still getting some decent yields out of switchgrass. Now, granted, we do a little bit better in a warmer climate, but the take home from this is we can grow these C4 grasses fairly far north and do pretty well with them. And again, nature teaches us that's the history of these sites. One other way to kind of look at that, this is a range map for big blue stem where it's been documented. And what I really want to point out to you is up here. I'm up into freaking I think that's the Great Slave Lake, and I'm up into Manitoba and Saskatchewan, or up here into Maine, St. Lawrence Seaway. So we can grow these grasses pretty far north. And that's important because the cold tolerance of the natives is such that if I get in this country here, I can definitely grow these grasses and grow them reasonably well. Bermuda grass, Dallas grass, probably a lot less so. And one other thing about the summer annuals is, again, they have a shorter growing season, so I'm going to tend to see some lower yields out of them than what we expect down here in the fescue belt. So again, we have grasses that can handle extreme drought, extreme flooding, and extreme cold. What about heat? And I'm not going to say much about heat, but here's a little fun fact for you. Big blue stem has 90% of its photosynthetic potential at 82 to 105 degrees Fahrenheit. So what's the midpoint of that? About 92, let's say. So 92, 93 degrees, hot, nasty weather. It's at 90% of its photosynthetic rate. But look at this. At 118 degrees Fahrenheit, it still is at 70% of its photosynthetic rate. Now, folks, I don't want to wish 118 degrees on anybody, but clearly these are grasses that can handle heat. And so if we are thinking about extremes of drought, flood, cold, heat, and we're looking for something that is adaptable to a wide range of conditions and can do so profitably, these native grasses have an awful lot to offer. A lot of resources that we've got on our webpage here. We've got a native grass college. a recent bulletin we put out on establishing native grasses, and a book that I produced here about 3 years ago that is probably more than you ever wanted to know about native grass forages, but again, a very good resource. And so with that, Jen, I don't know if we've got time at this point for questions, but I'll be glad to try to respond to some if there are any.
Great question, Pat. We are bumping into some lunchtime, but I'm walking back into the room to see if anyone has a burning question. I see a burning question from Keith.
Hey, great report. I'm assuming the 118 degrees and up to 105, you're talking about air temperature versus soil temperature, right?
That is leaf surface temperature, yeah.
Leaf surface, okay. And then the other question is, one of the challenges we had this year in our area, Maryland, is that, we had several months of dry, and a lot of the farmers that do raise hay ran into trouble getting any amount. And so what happened was whatever hay they got, they held back. So for folks like me that got to buy in hay, suddenly we were scrambling, trying to get hay for winter. You did a lot with forages and the nutrition value. Is there any data out there? Could we convince some of our farmers to switch over? I did a switch over to a lot of warm season grasses in my pastures, and it's been great. I did that almost a decade ago now. But is there any data out there would help us convince some of our farmers to start raising some of these warm season grasses instead of orchard grass so that they actually get some hay production, and maybe that we could convince them and it would help us with our nutrition for hay?
Yeah, I guess the way I respond to that is that we've got good data on what these grasses will yield. And again, it's going to vary year to year. And in some ways, we can't even explain it. There was a 8-year data set that came out of Blacksburg, Virginia, and I believe up in West Virginia too, Ed, the switchgrass study a few years back in the 90s. And that study basically did not relate switchgrass yield to rainfall, which seems insane. But it may be that they just didn't capture extreme droughts, like I showed you in that 2007 slide. But the point is that there's going to be variation year to year, but that 4 to 5 ton figure has been reinforced in many places. And I've shown you fertility for pastures, that we don't think you need to replace P and K. You don't need to lime. Depending on your needs for production, you can add some nitrogen. But in a hay setting, I would definitely tell somebody to be, testing their soil regularly, just make sure they're not mining any nutrients, right? But the point being that these high yields, these low inputs, the fact that you can cut in June and July, it's just in terms of cost effectiveness, it's a no-brainer. And, even if you wanted to go to some other warm season grass that wasn't a native, some of these same principles apply. They may not be as thrifty with nutrients, but, for instance, Bermuda grass loves nitrogen and it loves potash. But man, on an acre per acre basis, I could make the case, and I wouldn't replace a really good orchard grass hay field or any other good, healthy hay field. But if you've got one that you need to replace or renovate, why in the world not go to a warm season? Just because all the economics and yield and, flexibility in the face of drought. So I think we've got data that shows the yields, that shows the fertility requirements, that shows the economics. I would encourage you to take a look at that book I mentioned, and, you could email me and, we can provide you with some other data as well. But I think that there's a clear case that can be made.
Thank you so much, Pat, for joining. And I just want to encourage folks, we've got Pat's contact information. You can also message him through Hoover. Probably email's a little easier, I'm guessing. But thank you so much, Pat, thank you so much for joining us, Pat. And I hope you feel better.
Thank you so much. Enjoyed it, and y'all take care, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your meeting. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Pat.